I remember the cedar grove first, the way the light broke in thin ribs through the canopy, green and gold like stained glass in an empty church. On a waist-high lattice of hauled logs there lay a rifle I knew by serial number set crosswise, and quiet as if someone had placed it there to be considered. Not a drop of blood, not a boot scuff, not a note. Only that rifle waiting in the hush and the feeling that we were not the ones doing the looking. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. It was the kind of November that makes a man take smaller breaths. The air had a bite to it, the sort that nips through wool and lingers in your chest. Around here, the days shorten fast. Trucks idle longer in the diner lot. Steam leaves coffee cups in steady little columns that look like prayers you can see. Most folks in Glacier County measure the season not by calendars, but by sounds. The soft clack of chains going on tires. A furnace kicking awake at 5 a.m. The far-off report of a rifle rolling down the timber like a bowling ball through pins. It was a normal month. The kind that lets your guard down. My name is Marcus Reeves. I carry a badge in a county where rivers carve stone and news travels on snowmobile tracks. My office sits at the end of a hallway that hums with fluorescent lights and smells faintly of dust and winter coats. Most nights I worked late, not for any special medal, but because a pile of file folders doesn't walk itself to bed. I knew the beat: a trespass complaint, a fence line dispute, a wood stove flare-up. A quiet world with small edges until the day a man I'd nodded to for years stopped being a figure in my periphery and turned into a case number on my desk. I knew Camden Thorne the way lawmen know the steady ones through paperwork and the lack of it. He guided for a living, not the paper bag kind of outfit, but the well-run kind, with calendar blocks, clear maps, and clients who brought good boots and better tips. I'd see him at the counter of Sawyer's Supply comparing two kinds of lamp oil with the patience of a surgeon. He was built like someone who'd learned the names of wind directions by feel. He had a habit of tapping his knuckles twice on the counter when he said, "Thank you," a little rhythm that stuck. Camden kept to himself and kept his word, which counts for more than anything out here. Jasper Colt, I recognized from a different lane calls about stray shots near a meadow. He was working a polite complaint about a pickup that parked in a no-shoot zone on the refuge road. He was one of those men who traveled with the sky a long lens, swaddled in canvas hat, pulled low boots that never quite got clean. He brought me a photo once of a bull elk standing in fog with cottonwood leaves stuck to its shoulders like gold coins. He didn't say much while handing it over, just nodded. I tacked it on the bulletin board near the coffee maker for the kind of days when you forget there's beauty tied up with the headaches. Sheriff Hawkins ran the shop like a well-tuned tractor. Nobody noticed the belts until she took a day off and we all heard the squeak. She believed in things you could measure: weights, distances, times. If a person asked her opinion about anything else, she'd hand them a ruler first. It was a comfort having her down the hall, head bent over a ledger pencil behind her ear, the definition of weathered competence. She'd done 30 winters and kept going. The badge looked natural on her jacket, like it had grown there. By early November, we were in our routine trucks, dropping hunters at trailheads at Dawn Ranchers, closing gates behind them with that double pull you give to make sure the latch holds tourists driving slow along the river for one last look at water before it locks. The creek west of town burned dark in the afternoons, cold enough that the water looked thicker than it was. On those days, even the dogs grew considerate. They didn't bark unless there was cause. In a place like this, quiet is a keeper of peace, and we all made an effort to hand it around. Most evenings, I'd end up at Ruthie's Diner, a squat building undersized for the stories told inside it. You could read the season on the hooks by the door hats, in October parkas, in November scarves by Thanksgiving. The waitress, Jan, knew to turn the mug so the handle faced my right, a small kindness that lands bigger at 9 p.m. I'd sit near the back, take my time, watch headlights sweep the far wall when a pickup eased into the lot. Familiar rigs, familiar faces. Routine builds a shell. You start to think it's armor. We had a cold snap that week. Night temps rode the line between 12 and 18 degf enough to catch you if you made a lazy choice. Frost took over the bridge rails and left its hieroglyphics in the morning. I drove the back roads and listened to the weather radio, those clipped voices from towers I've never seen telling us how to dress and what to expect. North wind, 10 to 15 gusts to 20. Around here, that's just a note to keep your scarf up and your head down. Camden checked his tags at the courthouse on a Tuesday. 2 quick signatures, a nod to the clerk, a folded receipt in his breast pocket. He asked about a small change to a boundary line on one of his planned loops, wanted to make sure he wasn't crossing a private slot by mistake. That was his way, precise, respectful of lines on paper and lines under snow. I caught his eye as he stepped past the dispatch window. We traded a simple greeting. No omens, no shiver in the air, no ghost at the shoulder. If you want a sign, you won't find it in that moment. You'll find it in hindsight, the most unhelpful prophet we have. Back at the office, I took calls about a blown transformer on Coal Creek Road, a neighborly complaint about a woodpile that had crept across a property line, a coyote that kept appearing in the same ditch at the same times like it had an appointment. There was talk in town about the early winter. The old-timers said the geese had started flying low and fast over the flats, that the wind had a certain dry pitch to it. Folks chalked it up to weather the way you do. If it can be said in a sentence, it's probably not the thing that keeps you awake. Evenings stretched out. Smoke stacked straight up from chimneys before dark, a sure sign the air wasn't going anywhere. I drive home slow, not because of ice, but because it felt like a week where speed would be a kind of rudeness. My house sits on a hill that catches the last 10 minutes of sunset. I'd stand at the window, coffee going cool in my hand, and watch the grain of light move down the ridge. Small comforts. The thunk of the furnace. The dog 2 doors down, giving one bark and deciding that was enough. The mail truck's taillights cresting toward town. A couple of first cracks in retrospect were so slight they barely made sound. The dispatcher mentioned a short call that cut out a cell ping from somewhere north of the river that landed between towers like a skipped stone. She logged it without drama. We get those. A rancher I trust stopped by for salt blocks and said his cattle had bunched up strangely the night before, tight at the fence, like a storm was walking the pasture, though the sky was cold and clean. He laughed it off because men his age find comfort in the sound of their own doubt. I wrote the time down anyway, more out of habit than conviction. On my desk sat a small parcel from the university track comparisons for an unrelated case from October Bear Elk Human, the usual references. A tidy binder clip, a polite note. Doctor. Chen had included a page on winter gates in heavy snow for black bear. A little reminder that the ordinary can look extraordinary if you catch it at the wrong angle. I set it aside with a nod and went back to a report about a jackknifed utility trailer on the county line. Routine turned into a shine on everything. That's how it is. Before a break, the world goes glossy as if you're viewing it through a pane of glass you didn't know was there. You notice the small order of things, the way the clerk tears receipts, the way Jan sets the fork tines pointing left, the way the sheriff always checks her watch before she says goodnight. Those habits line up like fence posts across a field, and you walk along them without thinking. I slept well that week until I didn't. I made a habit of wiping down my desk before I left, part superstition, part courtesy to the morning version of me. On Thursday, my cloth snagged on a rough edge of the wood and left a small thread of gray no bigger than a hair. I plucked it free and had the oddest thought that the office itself was shedding. I shook my head at the silliness of it and turned out the light. Little moments stick when you don't know what else to hold. Camden's name crossed my path again at the ranger station, just a checkbox on a sign-in sheet for backcountry access. You could read his confidence from the neatness of his block letters and the clarity of his route notes. I glanced at it there under the plastic mat and thought only that the man knew his business. I noticed the thermos in his truck the next morning dented on the side, same place I'd seen it dented a year back when a pack frame caught it wrong. Small things endure around here, a nick in a tool, a chip in a mug, a habit of being careful. Jasper breezed through town the same morning, a nod through the diner window, the strap of his camera bag cutting a diagonal across his jacket. He carried himself the way photographers do when they've been somewhere alone and good, the slow, floaty gait of someone not done being quiet. He didn't stop in. Most men don't when they're carrying a fragile sort of mood. I watched him cross the sidewalk and disappear behind a feed truck. That was the last simple image of him I keep without the weight of the rest. Toward midday, Sheriff Hawkins and I stood on the courthouse steps and took in the kind of sky you'd call honest, no tricks, no promises. She mentioned a training the following week, a winter operations refresher we'd run in the lot with a rescue sled and a portable heater that never quite fights the wind off. We'd done it so many times, the hand signals were muscle memory. She tilted her head toward the hills and said we might need to add a second session if the early storm track held. I nodded. The talk was light and practical. It did not feel like preamble. That afternoon, I visited Sawyer's Supply for a box of staples and left with a spool of paracord because I always do. The owner Bill told me his son had seen something large run the timber rim at dawn, the kind of shape you catch when the mind's not fully awake. Moose, he decided aloud. Then, half an hour later, walked that back to maybe just shadow. He smiled at his own wobble, and we moved on to the price of propane refills. If there was a warning in the air, it hadn't learned how to speak to us yet, or we hadn't learned how to listen. I drove out toward the north line near dusk, the world thinned down to silhouettes and breath. The road had the crunch of salt under tires, a sound that makes conversation quiet by reflex. You get a lot of clear thinking done in those 15 minutes between town and timber. I thought about nothing special the school board meeting. Notice thumbtacked by the post office the way a certain house on River Road always leaves its porch light burning, even when no one's home. The pair of ravens that seemed to own the cottonwood near mile marker 12. I turned around at the cattle guard and headed back the way I came. When night falls hard here, it feels earned. The businesses close up one by one a row of dimming squares on Main Street. The plow makes a last pass. The gas station shuts off its sign. I've always liked that moment, the last glow before the town chooses sleep. I parked by the station and watched my reflection settle in the windshield. My phone sat quiet beside me on the seat. A neighbor waved and moved on. Nothing broke the pattern, not yet. You have to understand that to understand the shock of what followed. Before a storm, there's a world where people keep promises to one another without making them aloud. I went home, hung my coat by the door, and listened to the house tick as it adjusted to the temperature drop. In the kitchen, the refrigerator motor hummed like a long, calm breath. I stood with the window open to the cold and let it wash the room until the kettle whistled. I'm not a man who talks to himself, but I said out loud, "Tomorrow's a good day to start early." It felt like common sense, not foreshadowing. I set my alarm anyway. The next morning began like all sensible mornings do around here, with coffee strong enough to notice and boots lined up straight on the mat. I locked the door behind me and watched my breath drift off the porch and vanish. The cruiser warmed the defroster, tracing clean arcs on the glass. I backed into the street and rolled past my neighbor's place. Their porch light was still on, brighter than usual in the half-light, a pale coin hanging over an empty step. I told myself they'd simply left in a hurry, forgot to flick the switch. I told myself that twice. Then I drove on, and the light stayed burning into the day. The morning after I noticed that porch light still burning, I drove out to the sheriff's office just after dawn. The cold had deepened overnight, that kind of brittle cold that makes the world ring when a truck door slams. The coffee in the break room tasted like metal and wood smoke, same as always. Sheriff Hawkins was already there, pencil behind her ear, sorting through a stack of reports. She looked up when I came in and said almost to herself, "Camden Thorne hasn't checked in." The words didn't register at first. It wasn't unusual for guides to stay out an extra night if weather or luck kept them on the move. Still, something about the way she said it, measured without looking up, set a small weight in my stomach. By mid-morning, the radio chatter had started to pick up. A call from a man named Jasper Colt came through, his voice tight, deliberate, and carrying the kind of tone you only hear when someone's trying not to sound afraid. He said he'd been photographing elk in the Blackfoot wilderness 2 days earlier and had seen something in attack, he said, though his words faltered. I remember glancing at the clock. It was just after 10. The sheriff nodded toward me and said, "Marcus, you'd better take this one." When I reached Jasper's motel, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, his camera gear laid out like surgical tools. The blinds were half drawn and the room smelled faintly of wet wool and cheap coffee. He didn't rise when I came in, just looked at me with eyes that had been open too long. "I saw it," he said quietly before I'd even asked a question. "I saw what happened to Camden." I let the silence settle, gave him a moment to breathe. The best thing you can do in those moments is not rush the truth out of someone. It's to make space for it to arrive on its own. He told me he'd been on a ridge maybe 800 yards out, using a telephoto lens to track a small herd of elk near the creek line. He'd heard one rifle shot echo off the valley wall and looked down in time to see Camden steady his rifle for another. Jasper said there was a shape between the trees, big dark, moving on 4 legs. He thought it was a bear. Then, in his words, it stood up. He said it like he'd been saving the words for someone who wouldn't laugh. I wrote them down one by one. According to him, the figure rose cleanly like a man getting out of a chair. Then it turned and looked directly at Camden. He said there was a second shot, but it went wide. The sound of it, Jasper whispered, wasn't panic, it was disbelief. Then, through the lens, he'd seen movement fast, purposeful, and both figures vanished into the timber. He waited for another shot, a shout, anything. The only thing he heard was wind. I've taken hundreds of witness statements in my career, hunters, misidentifying shadows, hikers mistaking sound for threat. But Jasper's tone carried none of that uncertainty. His description was too controlled, too consistent. I asked about the distance visibility, whether he'd been drinking. He said no, and when he slid his memory card across the table, his hands didn't shake. I told him we'd analyze it with the lab, but I could see in his face he already knew what was on it. The sheriff approved a search before noon the next day. The temperature had dropped to 22, and the wind along the tree line whistled like something squeezing through cracks. We started at the trailhead where Camden's truck was found. Keys still in the ignition tags displayed on the dash. Everything squared away the way a guide would leave it if he planned to come back by sunset. 2 miles in, we found his camp clean, orderly sleeping bag, rolled coffee pot cooling on the ashes. No sign of struggle. That's the part that unnerved me most. Everything looked paused, not ended. We followed the marked path until it thinned into game trails. The dogs worked well at first, noses, low tails up. Then, near a grove of lodgepole pines, they changed. The lead dog, Rex, a seasoned shepherd with a spotless record, began whining and backing away from the tree line. His handler gave firm commands, but the animal wouldn't move forward. The others followed suit, Wine's tails tucked a wall of resistance. It's rare, but when animals refuse an area, you listen. Something in that grove wasn't right, and we all felt it before anyone said so aloud. The ground there was soft under a thin crust of frost. We found one spent casing lodged in the needles exactly where it should have fallen if Jasper's account was true. Camden's shooting rest was still marked by an imprint in the soil the shape of his forearm, visible where he'd steadied the rifle. 10 feet forward, scuff marks the kind you get when someone rises fast and loses footing. Beyond that, the story disappeared. No blood, no drag marks, no prints we recognized. But there were depressions, large ones deep as boot heels but shaped wrong. The stride between them was too long, too even to belong to anything we knew. I called in Dr. Sarah Chen from the university. She arrived the next morning bundled against the cold, her camera and measuring tools swinging from her shoulder. She didn't speak much while she worked, just measured, photographed, and made plaster casts. Later, she stood beside me with her gloves still on and said almost under her breath, "Whatever made these walked upright." I asked if she meant human. She shook her head. Heavier. Much heavier. She didn't speculate beyond that, and I respected her for it. Science hates empty space, but sometimes it has to stand there and admit it. The second day brought no new leads, just more cold and growing unease. We combed ravines, creek beds, even hollow stumps, calling Camden's name into a silence that absorbed every word. Late that afternoon, one of the volunteer teams found his backpack stuffed deep into a thicket deliberately hidden. Inside were his wallet tags, thermos half full, and his phone. We charged it back at base, scrolling through a few ordinary photos. Sunrise Camp elk tracks. Then the last image appeared, taken hastily, blurred. It showed something massive moving between trees about 50 yards off, upright, broad-shouldered, caught mid-stride. The timestamp placed it minutes before Jasper heard the shot. I can still remember the low hum of the fluorescent light in that small office as I stared at the screen. A picture is supposed to anchor a story, but this one deepened the fog. Hawkins stood over my shoulder, arms folded. "You think that's a man?" she asked. I didn't answer. The outline was wrong legs too long, neck too short, bulk where there shouldn't be. We logged it as evidence, but inside I felt the edges of rational explanation start to fray. By the third day, news of the missing hunter had spread through the county. That's when we got the call from a rancher named Dale Morrison. He lived just north of the search zone, a man known for two things: good cattle and plain speech. He told the dispatcher he'd seen something cross his pasture the night before Camden went missing. Wasn't no bear, he said. Walked like a man, but taller, wider. Moved like it had a purpose. I drove out there with Dr. Chen riding shotgun. Morrison met us on the porch rifle resting against the wall. He led us down to the meadow soft with thawed soil and pointed across the open ground toward the timber. Came from that way, he said. Full moon night. The herd pushed against the fence. I thought it was a cougar till I saw it stand. He stopped there, eyes narrowing as if seeing it again. It turned back once. Looked right at me. Felt like it was deciding something. He didn't embellish, didn't grin, just stared out at the field. We found prints there, too. Same pattern, same scale. They crossed his property in a clean, straight line, northbound. Stride steady as if following a map we couldn't see. Whatever had been shot 2 days earlier had kept walking uninjured. We followed the trail until rock replaced soil and the signs vanished. That evening, Dr. Chen sat at the station, drafting her notes. She spoke in quiet disbelief about the foot structure part primate, part human, but larger than both. If it's a hoax, she said finally, it's one built by someone with knowledge of anatomy and no shortage of strength. She didn't sound convinced it was a hoax. None of us did, though we didn't say that out loud. By day 4, things started to unravel. Reporters called local ones first, then voices from farther out who smelled a story. Hunters came forward with their own claims. Twisted trees, strange hollows, distant cries in the dark. We sorted them into piles, credible, possible, impossible. Still, a pattern began to form. Years of quiet sightings tucked away in hunting forums and campfire stories, all in this same stretch of country. That night, Jasper returned to the station with new information. He'd finally reviewed all his photos from that morning frame by frame. What he showed us felt like looking into another world. The first shots were ordinary Camden in position, rifle aimed. The next captured the instant of recoil. Then, in a sequence of blurred motion, the dark figure rose. You could see the slope of its shoulder, the line of its torso, and in one frame, a partial face, shadowed, heavy-browed, unmistakably intelligent. The final photo showed it moving toward Camden Arms, swinging in measured stride before both vanished behind the trees. No one spoke for a long time after. The sheriff leaned against the table, her hand over her mouth. Dr. Chen studied the prints we'd cast and whispered, "It shouldn't exist." I found myself wondering if disbelief could ever be enough to erase something real. We decided to lock the photographs away, limit access. Hawkins knew what media attention could do, thrill seekers, hoaxes, chaos. We'd keep the focus on finding Camden, nothing more. But the truth was, every one of us in that room already understood we were searching for a man who'd crossed into something we didn't have a name for. The next day, our aerial team spotted something on the northern edge of the search grid, a pattern under the trees that didn't match natural formation. A structure, maybe. The pilot said it looked deliberate. We packed light and hiked in 5 miles of punishing terrain before we saw a shelter made of enormous logs fitted together with precision that spoke of planning, not instinct. The wood bore grooves as if levered into place. Inside, the smell was old earth and damp cedar. Scattered across the ground were things that belonged to people: torn jackets, bits of cookware, a dented lantern. And there, centered against the far wall, was Camden's rifle. Not dropped. Placed, as if someone had wanted it found. I stood there longer than I meant to the light slanting through the gaps, dust floating like breath. No signs of a body. No blood. Only that rifle, and the feeling we'd stepped into someone else's space. Dr. Chen crouched beside the logs, running her gloved fingers over the tool marks. "These cuts," she murmured, "aren't animal. Something planned this." We took samples photographs, but no one raised their voice. The silence had a gravity you didn't want to disturb. When we stepped back into the open air, the cold hit like a reminder we still belonged to daylight. That evening, as the team debriefed, I found myself unable to shake the image of that rifle resting on its wooden altar, the idea that it was displayed, not abandoned. I wrote my notes carefully, facts only, though my thoughts were anything but clear. Hawkins told us to rest, start again at first light. None of us really slept. Just after dawn, one of the search dogs caught a scent near a creek 2 miles from that shelter. We followed boots sinking in the wet ground until we reached a clearing shaped by wind and stone. There, leaning against a boulder, was Camden Thorne. Alive, barely. His face was hollowed out, eyes wide and distant. He didn't recognize us at first. When we tried to speak to him, he only whispered about being watched, studied. "It wasn't trying to kill me," he said. "It was trying to understand me." We airlifted him out, wrapped in blankets, his hands trembling, though the air was still. As the helicopter rose, I looked back toward the line of cedars. For a moment, I thought I saw motion between the trunks. Nothing distinct, just the slow rhythm of something turning away. That image has never left me. When Camden finally began to talk, his words would shake every assumption I'd carried into those woods. But that came later. For now, all I had was the echo of rotor blades fading into a cold sky and the feeling that the forest itself had closed its mouth. When the helicopter carrying Camden disappeared beyond the ridge, the air felt strangely hollow, like the woods had drawn a breath and refused to let it out. We stayed behind long enough to gather what little evidence the clearing offered: a torn strap from his pack, 2 footprints leading nowhere, and then we started the slow hike back toward the staging area. No one spoke. The radio cracked every now and then with updates about his condition, but mostly there was the sound of snow sliding off branches and the rhythm of our boots over half-frozen ground. You could feel it among us, that mix of relief and unease that comes from finding someone alive, but not really whole. Back at base, Sheriff Hawkins took over communication with the hospital. Camden had been sedated, but the paramedics' report was already strange. No physical injuries beyond dehydration and mild exposure. They said he'd been mumbling things about eyes in the dark, about being watched. I stayed long enough to fill out a preliminary statement, then stepped outside to get some air. The wind had picked up and the cold was sharp enough to make your teeth ache. I remember staring at the tree line, the same one we'd combed for days, and realizing how little sense any of it made. A man doesn't just vanish into forest and come back without a scratch talking like he's seen the other side of reason. Over the next 2 days, I visited him 3 times at the hospital in Kalispell. Each visit felt like walking into a dream I didn't belong in. Camden sat propped up in the bed, clean-shaven now, his skin a pale yellow from lack of sunlight. His hands trembled when he reached for his cup, though his voice, when he spoke, came low and steady. The first time, he barely looked at me. The second, he managed a faint grin, the kind people give when they're pretending they're fine. It wasn't until the third visit that he began to talk. He told the story slowly, eyes on the floor, as if replaying each moment in sequence. He remembered tracking what he thought was a large bear lining up for the shot, feeling the recoil and then watching the animal stand upright. It wasn't surprise, he said, shaking his head. It was like it expected me. He described the way it moved, deliberate, almost cautious, the steps, too even for any creature he'd ever seen. It could have torn me apart, he whispered. But it didn't. What came next unsettled me more than any of the rest. Camden said it studied him. Not like prey, not like curiosity. It was closer to recognition. He remembered its eyes, dark and steady, not panicked or wild. Then, after a long pause, he said something that made the hairs on my arms rise. It wanted to understand me, he said. Like it had never seen a man before, but knew what one was supposed to be. He claimed it led him deeper into the forest, to the shelter we'd found. The creature hadn't spoken, but made noises, short, resonant sounds that carried shape like language buried under instinct. He said he was given water from a spring and food that looked like roots and berries. It didn't need to, he said, almost pleading. It could have let me die there, but it didn't. When I asked how long he'd been kept there, he said it was hard to tell. There was daylight, then dark, then light again, but time didn't feel real inside those trees. I wanted to ask a dozen questions, but stopped myself. The look on his face told me he was balancing on the edge of something fragile. He rubbed his eyes and said the creature watched him constantly, head tilted as if waiting for him to make sense of something. Then, one morning, it stood, made a deep, low sound, like a warning, he said, and turned away. Camden had followed for a short distance before realizing he was alone. By dusk, the search team had found him. When I left the hospital that evening, the sun was slipping behind the mountains, bleeding orange through the haze. I sat in my truck for a while, listening to the heater click and thinking about everything he'd said. The facts didn't add up, but facts rarely do when fear distorts them. Yet his calmness unnerved me most. There was no wildness in his retelling, no desperation to prove what he'd seen, just quiet conviction. Back at the department, I met with Hawkins and Dr. Chen to review our findings. The sheriff looked tired, lines deep around her eyes. Dr. Chen had spread her photographs across the table, the casts, the tracks, the scale markers. I can't explain these, she admitted. The depth alone suggests something over 600 pounds. The prints aren't hoaxed. The substrate compression is too precise. Hawkins rubbed her temple. So what do we tell the press, she asked. We agreed on a cautious statement, a missing person found alive, circumstances under investigation. Nothing more. But secrecy never lasts long in small towns. Word leaked within 48 hours first from a volunteer who'd seen the shelter, then from someone in the rescue unit who mentioned the photographs. Soon the phone lines were a mess. Calls came from reporters, from Bigfoot researchers, from people insisting they'd seen something similar years ago. Hawkins slammed her office door after the third TV station rang. We're not turning this into a circus, she said. I believed her, but the circus had already started setting up its tents. The days that followed blurred into noise, half-truths, sightings, and letters from across the country claiming knowledge of the Blackfoot creature. I tried to stay grounded in the evidence, but the evidence itself didn't behave. Every logical avenue collapsed under its own weight. That's when Dr. Chen returned with another report, this one from a plaster cast she'd re-examined under lab conditions. She'd noticed minute striations across the surface parallel marks that didn't occur naturally. "Tool use," she said, almost whispering. Something manipulated the logs at that shelter with intention, not claws or random leverage. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself driving out toward Morrison's ranch, the place where those northern tracks had led. The snow was hard under the tires, the headlights cutting through a fine silver mist. When I reached the meadow, I parked and killed the engine. For a long time, there was nothing, just wind pushing through the grass. Then, from somewhere deep in the timber, I heard a sound. It wasn't a cry or a roar. It was low-rounded and impossibly deep, like air moving through a hollow chest. It came once, then faded. I told myself it was a bull elk calling for the herd, though I'd hunted enough seasons to know the difference. The next morning, the sheriff called an emergency briefing. She'd received a call from a helicopter crew that had gone up again to complete mapping of the northern boundary. They'd spotted another structure, this one deeper in the wilderness, partially collapsed under snow. The coordinates put it nearly 15 miles from Camden's last known position. Hawkins looked at me and said, "We're going." We reached the site near dusk. The sun filtered through the cedars in thin bands, the light fading to gray. The structure was built the same way massive logs fitted together with strange precision. But inside this one, there was nothing human. No remnants, no equipment, no sign of habitation, just the hollow scent of age and something faintly metallic, like old stone. Dr. Chen moved quietly through the space, her flashlight beam tracing across the walls. "It's older," she murmured. "Much older." We camped a short distance away that night, too far to see it, but close enough to feel it. I sat by the fire long after the others turned in. I kept thinking about the placement of the rifle in the first shelter, the careful way it had been laid out. That wasn't random. It felt like communication, though, of what kind I couldn't guess. Around midnight, the forest went still. No wind, no owls, no rustling. It was the kind of silence that feels sentient. I didn't sleep much after that. When we returned to town, the hospital released Camden under quiet supervision. He'd stopped talking about the creature, though his eyes gave him away. Sometimes people who've seen too much learn to protect themselves by silence. I asked him once gently if he remembered the warning the creature gave before letting him go. He nodded. "It told me not to come back," he said. I asked if he thought it meant the forest. He hesitated, then replied no. It meant people like me. That answer stayed with me. The sheriff finalized the report a week later. Officially, it read like any other recovered person file: accidental disorientation, mild exposure, no evidence of foul play. The real documents, the casts, the photos, the recordings were sealed under restricted access. Only 4 people held copies: the sheriff, myself, Dr. Chen, and the state liaison in Helena. We all agreed not to speak of it publicly. Still, every time I drove that northern road, I felt the weight of what we hadn't explained pressing through the pines. Months passed. Snow melted. The calls dwindled to a trickle, then stopped. On paper, the story ended there. But late that spring, a package arrived at my desk with no return address. Inside was a single photo printed on glossy paper, a night shot of the forest, dark and grainy, taken from what looked like a trail camera. In the lower corner, half caught in shadow, was a shape. Upright, motion blurred, familiar. No note, no name. Just that image and a small line of handwriting on the back, still watching. I sat there a long time, the hum of the office muffled behind me. Outside, a storm was gathering over the peaks, clouds rolling slow and deliberate. I turned the photo over again, the ink from the words bleeding slightly into the paper. Somewhere out there, between what we believe and what we fear, something was moving in the timber, and deep down I knew this wasn't the end of it. I didn't tell anyone about the photograph right away. There's a point in every investigation where you stop asking whether something is real and start asking why it won't leave you alone. That photo, dark grainy, the shape half swallowed by trees, sat on my desk for 3 days before I slipped it into an evidence envelope and filed it under my own name. I told myself it was just in case it mattered later. Truth was, I wasn't ready for another conversation that started with disbelief and ended with someone lowering their voice. By then, the snow had melted from the valley floor, the forest turning that particular color between green and gray when new growth hides old scars. You'd think the distance from winter would have dulled what happened, but it only sharpened the edges. Camden had gone home to his family. We didn't speak much after that, just one short call where he thanked me for finding him and said he was trying to sleep again. He'd sold all his gear rifles packs, even his camp stove, and was planning to move closer to his sister's place down in Idaho. He sounded like a man who'd lost his compass, not in a physical sense, but in that quiet way some people do after they've looked at something they can't explain. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. At the office, the story had gone still, but silence in a sheriff's department is never the same as closure. Dr. Chen was still analyzing the casts and comparing them to archived prints, though she'd already confided there was nothing remotely similar in any catalog. Hawkins had arranged for all files to be sealed under ongoing research assistance, a technical label that meant no one outside our circle could request them. The local paper had moved on to stories about spring flooding and a stolen tractor. Life on the surface had resumed. But underneath, something stayed restless. One afternoon in May, a forestry pilot radioed in to say he'd noticed odd formations on a slope about 10 miles north of the first shelter site, tree trunks arranged in rough circles visible only from above. It wasn't unusual for fallen timber to create patterns after a storm, but something in his voice made me listen closer. He said they were too neat, that each trunk lay parallel as if placed by hand. Hawkins agreed to send a small team, and somehow my name ended up on the list. I didn't argue. The hike in took the better part of a day. The trail dissolved halfway up the ridge, leaving us to cut through underbrush that stank of sap and thawed mud. When we reached the coordinates, the air went unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums. The pilot hadn't exaggerated. In the clearing below stood another structure larger than the first, its framework half collapsed under the weight of fallen snow. The logs were thicker, the arrangement more deliberate, an interlocking lattice that formed walls and a low archway at the front. Even in ruin, it held a strange symmetry. We approached slowly. No one said a word. The wind shifted through the cedars, carrying the faint scent of something metallic, like old iron. Inside the structure, I saw no signs of habitation, only emptiness. And then, as my flashlight swept across the dirt floor, the reflection of something pale and round. I knelt and brushed the soil aside. It was a stone smooth as river glass, carved with parallel lines that spiraled toward its center. I turned it over in my palm and felt a faint groove running along its edge like it had been shaped for a purpose. Dr. Chen joined me, crouching low, her breath clouding in the beam of light. "That's tool work," she said softly, "but not with metal. Something harder than bone, though. Quartz or basalt." She looked around the space again, scanning the beams and ceiling as if expecting more. Whatever built this wasn't improvising. We cataloged everything: measurements, photographs, samples, but the deeper we documented, the less it made sense. The construction wasn't random. It was patterned, efficient, even elegant in a way. Some logs had been peeled of bark with long, sweeping scrapes, others positioned to brace against each other at precise angles. No animal behavior fit what we were seeing. Yet we had no evidence of human presence, no fire pits, no footprints, no discarded tools, only intention without identity. As dusk fell, we camped nearby. The others turned in early, but I stayed up by the embers, staring into the tree line. Every so often the wind would rise and the forest would whisper, and I'd catch myself listening for something movement, a breath proof. When the fire burned low, I walked a few yards beyond the camp. The moon was out thin and high. I stopped beside a tree and noticed faint marks carved into the bark, vertical grooves arranged in pairs. not claw marks. Too symmetrical, too even. My hand fit between two of them perfectly, the distance measured like fingers instead of claws. By morning, we were ready to head back. Dr. Chen packed her samples carefully, still frowning at the stone she'd taken from the floor. Before we left, she turned to me and said, "I don't think this was the first shelter. I think it was a workshop." I asked what she meant. "The angles, the grooves, it's like practice. The first one we found, it was built better." We hiked out in silence. The sheriff decided to keep the discovery under wraps for now, citing public safety concerns. Though privately, she admitted she didn't want to invite more people into those woods. She wasn't superstitious, but she'd been doing this long enough to recognize when a story had crossed the line from explainable to contagious. Once it spreads, reason can't catch up to it. Summer came on early that year. The rivers ran full and high snowmelt, turning the valley to glass in the evenings. I tried to focus on the work that stayed within the boundaries of ordinary life: traffic calls, petty thefts, the kind of things you can write reports about without feeling the weight of something looking back. But the nights were worse. Every time the wind shifted through the cedars outside my house, I'd hear that low sound again, that rounded hum that had followed me since Morrison's meadow. I kept telling myself it was wind through a hollow trunk, maybe a moose in the draw. The human brain's good at giving itself stories to sleep by. Then, in late July, I got a call from Dr. Chen. Her voice was tight. She said the plaster cast of the first footprint had shown traces of something embedded in the soil, a hair strand coarse and translucent, thicker than human. She'd run a spectral analysis and found keratin patterns consistent with primate origin but not matching any known species. She laughed once softly, the way people do when they run out of logic. "If I publish this," she said, "they'll end my career." That night I drove out past the north line again just to see the sky over the peaks. Halfway there, my headlights caught a shape by the shoulder of the road, broad upright, gone in a blink. I slammed the brakes and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The beam of my flashlight swung over the trees, catching nothing but fog. But in the dirt beside the culvert, there was a fresh print, the same deep depression I'd seen before, melting at the edges from the heat of the day. I crouched there listening. The woods held their breath. When I returned to the station, I didn't file a report. Some truths only survive in silence. Instead, I took out the photo that had come in the mail, the one with the shape caught in shadow, and placed it next to a copy of the new cast. Different mediums, same proportions, same stride length. I sat there for a long time, staring at both until the light outside went blue. By August, the public chatter had quieted the way storms do when they've moved too far to chase. Camden's family called once more to say he'd sold his house and relocated somewhere near Boise. They didn't know how to reach him now. Dr. Chen took a sabbatical, leaving a brief note on my desk. "Don't go back without telling someone." She didn't specify where back was. She didn't need to. And yet I did go back one last time. Not as an investigator, but as a man who couldn't leave a page half-turned. I parked near the old trailhead before dawn, the air cool and sharp. The forest smelled the way it always had, damp and clean, untouched. I followed the creek north past the place where the dogs had once refused to go until the ground rose beneath my feet, and the light changed from silver to gold. I stopped then because I knew I wasn't alone. It wasn't sight that told me, it was the stillness, the absence of wind. I could feel it at my back before I heard it move. Just one step, deliberate and heavy. I turned slowly, heart drumming so hard it felt audible. Between the trees, half veiled by mist, something tall stood motionless, the outline blurred but unmistakable. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. We stayed that way for what felt like minutes, but was probably seconds. Two creatures both caught in the act of recognition. Then it turned, walked deeper into the forest, and was gone. I didn't follow. I walked back to my truck without running, hands trembling against the cold steel of the door. I sat there waiting for the shaking to stop. When I finally looked up, the ridge was empty sunlight spilling over it like nothing had happened. But the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. Some boundaries aren't marked on any map. You cross them once, and the world stops being the same. That night, as I wrote my report, the one I knew no one would ever read, I left the final line unfinished. Not because I didn't know how to end it, but because part of me understood it hadn't ended at all. And even now, years later, when the wind moves through the cedars just right, I swear I can hear that same low hum echoing back from somewhere deep in the timber, patient and alive, as if reminding me it's still there. After that day on the ridge, I stopped trying to explain what I'd seen. You learn over years in law enforcement that not every truth belongs in a report. Some things fit only inside the quiet parts of your own mind, the ones that wake up in the middle of the night and stay there until morning. I turned in the file 2 days later, an inch-thick folder that looked ordinary from the outside but held more questions than answers. Hawkins skimmed the paperwork without speaking. When she finished, she closed it, slid it into her desk drawer, and said softly, "Let's leave this one where it is." Camden Thorne never came back to Montana. He moved south, remarried eventually, and lived out his days quietly. Every few Christmases, a card would arrive at the station, no return address, just a picture of a lake or a stretch of highway and the words, "Still grateful." His handwriting grew shakier over the years until it stopped altogether. When I heard he'd passed peacefully in his sleep, I sat in my truck for a long while before turning the key. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something heavier than that, a kind of recognition that the man had carried the weight of a story no one else could believe, and somehow he'd still found peace enough to let it go. Jasper Colt gave up photography not long after. He tried to sell his gear, then changed his mind and left it with the ranger station for educational use. "Let somebody else look through it," he told me once. "Maybe they'll see something I couldn't." He moved back east, closer to family, and took up woodworking. The last time we spoke, he mentioned the quiet, how it used to bother him, how now he found comfort in it. I think he meant more than just the noise of machines. Dr. Sarah Chen stayed in touch the longest. For a few years, she continued her research quietly under different projects: wildlife behavior, environmental adaptation. Once over coffee, she told me she still had that hair sample locked in a freezer at her lab. "Part of me wants to destroy it," she said. "Part of me can't." She retired early, settled near Flathead Lake, and started volunteering with park safety programs, teaching hikers how to respect what they don't understand. She never mentioned the Blackfoot case again, but every so often she'd send me an article about new primate fossils found in Asia or unexplained DNA in northern samples. No message attached, just the link. As for Hawkins, she finished her 30 years with the department and moved to Oregon to be near her grandchildren. We spoke on the phone the week before she left. She said she still kept the original photos locked in a safety deposit box for the day someone finally asks the right questions. I told her no one ever would, and she just laughed. "That's the point," she said. "Maybe not knowing is the only thing that's kept us sane." The county changed, as all places do. Roads widened, cabins turned into rentals, the wilderness maps got smaller. But some parts of those woods never welcomed tourists, and the locals still talk about how their dogs won't track north of the creek or how a rifle shot sounds different up there, muted somehow like the air itself swallows it. You hear stories about hunters who go quiet halfway through a trail, turning back without saying why. Nobody presses them. Every town has its ghost story. Ours just happens to breathe. I stayed on a few more years before retiring. I couldn't quite bring myself to leave Montana, so I bought a small place outside of town, close enough to the foothills to smell the pine when it rains. The mornings are my favorite, the mist lifting off the river, the sound of a distant woodpecker echoing through the valley. That's the rhythm that keeps me steady now. Every so often someone will ask me about the Blackfoot file, usually a young deputy or a student reporter who's heard whispers from an uncle or a teacher. I always tell them the same thing. It was a missing person case and the man was found alive. Then I changed the subject. But the truth is I think about it more often than I'd like to admit. Not the creature itself, though. That image still comes to me sometimes when I'm standing at the tree line, but the look on Camden's face when he talked about being studied. There was no fear left in him by then, only understanding. It's taken me years to realize that was the part that frightened me most. Whatever it was in those woods, it didn't act like a predator. It acted like a mirror, and Camden didn't like what it reflected back at him. Maybe none of us would. Over time, I learned that silence can be its own kind of witness. The files remained sealed, the plaster casts stored in a back room at the university, forgotten by everyone but the few of us who were there. Sometimes I wonder if they'll outlast us, those shapes pressed into hardened soil, proof of something our minds still aren't built to hold. Or maybe they'll crumble one day and become just another piece of earth which feels about right. Maybe some truths are meant to fade back into the dirt they came from. A few years ago, during a late snowfall, I took a drive out toward the North Line. The old access road was nearly gone by then, swallowed up by time and runoff. I stopped where the asphalt ended and walked a little way in following what was left of the trail. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. I stood there until the wind picked up and the cedars began to sway. It felt almost like breathing. I thought about all the people whose names had passed through that investigation, about how each of us had gone our separate ways trying to make sense of it. In the end, none of us did. But maybe that's the wrong measure. Maybe it was never about understanding. Maybe it was about remembering that there are still corners of this world that don't owe us explanations. I still get letters sometimes addressed to Detective Reeves, retired. Most are harmless folks claiming sightings or offering theories. A few include photographs. I don't open them anymore. They go into a drawer sealed like the evidence boxes once did. But one arrived last winter that made me pause. It was handwritten, no signature. Inside was a single sentence. "You were right to listen to the silence." I sat with that for a long while. There's comfort in thinking some things stay buried, but I know better. The wilderness keeps its own records. They're not written on paper, but in sound, in memory, in the way a man hesitates before crossing a shadowed line of trees. I still drive past that ridge now and then, especially in autumn when the light falls low and the air smells of pine pitch and frost. Sometimes I park on the shoulder roll down the window and just listen. The forest never sounds the same twice. There are moments when the wind moves just right and carries a low hum across the valley, soft, almost human. I tell myself it's the trees. It probably is. But I stay there until it fades just to be sure. People like to think every story ends cleanly with names, dates, outcomes. But most of the time what's left are fragments, the weight of a photo in your hand, the hollow sound of boots on frozen ground, a breath of wind that shouldn't have been there. We live with those fragments. We learn from them even when we don't fully understand them. If you were to ask me now what I believe, I'd tell you this. There's more in those woods than we'll ever see. And not all of it means harm. Some of it's just watching, same as we do, trying to understand the strange creatures that wander too deep and never come back quite the same. So I keep my distance. I tend my small life, make my coffee, watch the river thaw and freeze again. But on certain nights when the moon hangs low and the world feels still enough to listen, I think about Camden, about Jasper, about all of us who stepped too far past what we could explain, and I hope whatever's out there knows we tried to meet it with respect. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Somewhere out there between the silence and the wind, I think it's still listening.